Power has never been louder. We live in a world that measures strength by visibility. The louder you are, the more powerful you appear. Social media rewards confidence that borders on arrogance. Leaders are celebrated for dominance, not depth. Even spirituality has become a performance. The louder the mantra, the quicker the illusion of peace. But Carl Jung warned that what appears powerful is often the weakest of all. Because the ego, that restless, self-defining voice that must always be seen, heard, admired, is terrified of silence. Silence exposes its fragility. It reveals that behind the loud certainty of the ego stands something far quieter, older, and infinitely more intelligent, the soul. Jung called this deeper presence the self, the totality of who we are, not just the mask we show to the world. The ego, on the other hand, is the small circle within that greater whole, the center of conscious identity, necessary but not sovereign. Its job is to help us navigate the outer world. But somewhere along the line, the ego forgets its place. It mistakes itself for the self. It believes I am the center, when in truth, it is only a fragment orbiting the vast unknown depths of the psyche. This is where quiet power begins, in the realization that control, visibility, and dominance are illusions the ego uses to feel safe. The soul has no need to be seen, because it already knows. Its authority does not depend on validation, nor its strength on competition. The soul moves silently, and in that silence, it dismantles every false structure the ego has built. You can see this dynamic everywhere, in politics, in workplaces, in families, even within yourself. The ego must assert, I'm right. I know. I'm important. It feeds on comparison and applause. But the soul waits. It listens. It watches the ego exhaust itself in endless defense. And when the noise finally dies down, the soul steps forward, not to win, but to reveal. Jung observed that people who appear humble, introspective, or reserved often carry a quiet intensity that unsettles others. This is not weakness, it is integration. They have confronted their inner chaos and no longer need to prove their worth externally. Their confidence arises not from self-assertion but from self-knowledge. That is the paradox of true power: the more deeply you know yourself, the less you need to advertise it. The more you confront your inner contradictions, the less the outer world can threaten you. The ego fights for control, the soul simply is. But the modern world has made egoic inflation almost inevitable. We are told to build a personal brand, speak our truth, claim our space. These slogans sound empowering, but they often fuel the very insecurity they pretend to cure. The louder we shout, the more we fear silence. The more we project confidence, the more fragile our identity becomes when unrecognized. Jung saw this tension as the central neurosis of modern humanity, the overdevelopment of the ego at the expense of the self. When the ego grows too strong, it cuts us off from the unconscious, from meaning, from instinct, from soul. We become clever but empty, successful but restless, connected but profoundly alone. Quiet power is the antidote. It is the strength that comes not from expansion but from integration, from uniting the conscious and unconscious, the light and shadow, the outer ambition and inner truth. It is the force of someone who has stopped running from themselves. In Jung's language, this is the path of individuation, the lifelong process through which the ego learns its rightful place in service to the self. It is not about destroying the ego, but humbling it, refining it, transforming it into a vessel through which the soul can act in the world. And when that transformation begins, something remarkable happens: the need for noise disappears. You no longer compete, because you no longer feel separate. You no longer need to prove, because you already are. This is the secret to quiet power, the kind that does not shout, does not demand, does not seek to dominate, yet moves mountains simply by being aligned with truth. In the chapters ahead, we'll explore how Jung understood this inner revolution. How the ego inflates to protect us from fear. How the soul dismantles that illusion with silence, and how real power emerges only when we surrender to something greater than our conscious will. Because in the end, it is not the loudest voice that leads us forward, it is the quiet knowing beneath it. Section 1. The inflation of the ego, when the false self takes the throne. Jung once wrote that, the possession of power invariably intoxicates. He wasn't just referring to kings, politicians, or CEOs, he was speaking of the psychological intoxication that happens inside every individual when the ego mistakes itself for the totality of who they are. This inflation is not dramatic at first. It begins quietly, almost invisibly, the way a shadow lengthens with the setting sun. The moment you start identifying completely with your successes, titles, roles, or achievements, the ego begins to expand beyond its natural limits. It starts to believe it is the whole story. You see this in those who cannot tolerate being questioned. In those who confuse loud certainty with truth. In those who speak endlessly but rarely listen. They live in a self-constructed kingdom of identity, yet this kingdom stands on sand. The ego may wear the crown, but the soul, patient and silent, waits for the storm that will reveal what the throne was built upon. The birth of the false self. Jung saw the ego as essential to life in society. Without it, we could not distinguish ourselves from others, set goals, or function in the world. But he warned that the ego's survival instinct can easily turn it into a tyrant. To protect itself from pain, the ego creates a mask, what Jung called the persona. The persona is the version of you that earns approval, that fits into the world's expectations. It's the good employee, the devoted partner, the confident leader. But the more you identify with this image, the more you lose contact with what's behind it, the raw, unpolished truth of the self. The false self is not evil, it's a defense. It's the story the ego tells to survive. Yet every story built on denial becomes brittle. When life inevitably challenges that story, through failure, loss, aging, betrayal, or even success that feels hollow, the ego panics. It doubles down on control. It speaks louder. It demands recognition. Because silence would mean facing the possibility that everything it built was never truly you. This is what Jung called ego inflation, when the conscious identity becomes so dominant that it suppresses the rest of the psyche. It's like trying to silence an entire orchestra so that only one instrument can be heard. At first it sounds clear, strong, confident, but soon it becomes unbearable. The fragility of loud power. We often mistake loudness for strength, but Jung would say the opposite is true. Loud power is fragile. It depends entirely on external validation. The ego that shouts, "I am," does so only because it fears what lies beneath that declaration, the uncertainty of the unconscious, the reality of impermanence, the shadow of its own inadequacy. That's why inflated egos are easily wounded. One criticism, one rejection, one loss, and the illusion cracks. The louder the ego, the more fragile the person behind it. It's not resilience that drives them, it's terror of silence. You can observe this in yourself in subtle moments. When you feel the urge to prove someone wrong. When you interrupt just to be heard. When you can't rest until you've been acknowledged. These are small flares of egoic inflation, the psyche's way of saying, "I am losing contact with the deeper ground." The tragedy is that our culture rewards this fragility. Confidence is confused with certainty. Charisma is mistaken for wisdom. The people who shout the loudest about their truth are applauded, even when they are completely disconnected from their inner world. Jung would see this as a collective neurosis, an epidemic of inflated egos competing to fill the void left by a forgotten soul. The soul's silent rebellion. But the soul does not stay silent forever. It rebels, not through violence, but through disruption. Jung observed that when the ego inflates, the unconscious compensates. It sends dreams, synchronicities, and crises that challenge the illusion of control. What the ego calls bad luck or failure is often the psyche's way of restoring balance. If you've ever had your plans collapse, your reputation questioned, or your certainty dissolve, you've met this silent rebellion. The soul dismantles what is false so that what is real can emerge. It will strip away your pride until humility remains. It will expose your weakness until compassion is born. It will take your voice until you learn to listen. This process can feel brutal. The ego experiences it as humiliation or defeat. But Jung insisted that such experiences are sacred, they mark the beginning of individuation, the moment when the ego begins to learn its rightful place. The collapse of ego inflation is not destruction, it's initiation. The wisdom of the fall. Quiet power is born precisely in this fall. When the ego loses its false throne, a deeper order begins to appear. You start to realize that control is not mastery. That dominance is not authority. That being heard is not the same as being understood. From Jung's perspective, this fall from inflation is not optional, it is inevitable. Every ego, no matter how strong, will meet its limit. Life will confront it with something it cannot manipulate: time, loss, death, love, failure, or the mysterious workings of the unconscious. Those who resist this fall become rigid, brittle, defensive. Those who surrender become whole. True strength, Jung said, is born from the acceptance of limitation. The ego that learns humility becomes an ally of the soul. It stops trying to control everything and begins to serve something greater. And that's where quiet power begins, not in the noise of assertion, but in the stillness of alignment. Because the soul does not need to prove itself. It does not argue, it does not compare, it does not beg to be seen. Its power is not in domination but in presence. And presence, as Jung understood, is the most disarming force in the world. In the next section, we'll explore how this quiet intelligence, the self, begins to reclaim its authority once the ego's noise subsides, and why silence, paradoxically, is the soul's loudest language. Section 2. The soul's silent intelligence, how stillness defeats the ego. When the noise of the ego finally cracks, something subtle begins to stir beneath it, a quiet awareness that does not announce itself but watches patiently. Jung called this the movement of the self, the organizing principle of the psyche, the living totality that includes both what we know and what we repress, both our light and our shadow. The ego, by contrast, is loud precisely because it is insecure. It must speak to exist. It must be validated to survive. The soul has no such anxiety. It knows that what is true does not need constant defense. It does not seek attention, it draws it naturally, through authenticity, through presence. The intelligence beneath thought. The modern world prizes intellect, analysis, logic, strategy. But Jung saw these as tools of the ego. The soul's intelligence operates differently. It reveals itself through intuition, symbols, dreams, sudden insights that arrive from nowhere. Its logic is non-linear, its language metaphorical. When you are quiet enough, this deeper intelligence begins to speak, not in words, but in movements of feeling and synchronicity. It guides you toward wholeness by confronting you with what you've ignored. It might send you recurring dreams, inexplicable coincidences, or emotional reactions that seem out of proportion. Each is a message from the self, bypassing the ego's filters. But this communication requires silence. The ego, with its constant commentary, drowns it out. To hear the self, one must unlearn the reflex to explain, justify, or categorize everything. Jung called this the practice of active imagination, a dialogue with the unconscious, where reason bows to intuition, and the psyche reveals its own wisdom. This is not passivity. It's the opposite. It's a radical receptivity, the courage to stop imposing and start listening. And that listening becomes the foundation of quiet power. Stillness as revolt. In a culture addicted to motion, stillness is an act of rebellion. We rush from task to task, consuming noise, seeking stimulation, terrified of pauses. But the soul thrives in the pauses. Jung believed that most modern neuroses stem from the refusal to sit in silence with one's inner life. When you finally stop, truly stop, you discover that silence is not empty. It's full of everything the ego has been running from: fear, grief, longing, shame, beauty. At first, the encounter feels unbearable. But if you stay, something extraordinary happens. Beneath the chaos, you begin to sense an order, a quiet coherence that does not depend on you. This is the self, the silent intelligence that has been guiding you all along. You realize that while the ego was busy constructing its story of control, another process was unfolding in the background, orchestrating your growth through failure, loss, and love. The soul does not need you to be perfect, it needs you to be aware. Jung wrote that, the self is not only the center but also the circumference which embraces both conscious and unconscious. In other words, the soul is not something you find. It's something you remember. It was there before you learned who you were supposed to be. The end of the argument. The ego lives in opposition, it needs conflict to define itself. The soul dissolves opposition by revealing the hidden unity beneath it. That's why people who have gone through deep inner transformation often appear calm even amid chaos. They are not indifferent, they are integrated. They no longer need to argue with life because they've stopped arguing with themselves. When Jung treated patients suffering from anxiety, he noticed a pattern: those obsessed with control were the most restless. Their minds were filled with inner debates: should I? Shouldn't I? What if I fail? The ego tried to think its way out of suffering. But the soul doesn't think, it witnesses. It allows the tension to exist until meaning emerges naturally. Stillness, therefore, is not resignation. It is the refusal to feed the noise. It is the decision to let truth reveal itself rather than to force it. And in that stillness, one gains a strange power, not the power to control, but the power to endure, to perceive, to transform. This is why those who have suffered deeply often radiate peace. They've discovered that silence can withstand anything. The ego breaks under the weight of uncertainty, the soul bends and expands. The ego reacts, the soul responds. The ego fears loss, the soul sees transformation. The quiet field. Jung compared the psyche to a field where conscious and unconscious energies interact. When the ego is too loud, the field becomes distorted, nothing can grow. But when the ego quiets, the field stabilizes, and insight arises spontaneously. This is what mystics across traditions have called grace, the emergence of a higher order once personal control dissolves. In practical terms, this means that when you stop insisting, life begins to cooperate. You meet the right people, the right books, the right moments. Not by manipulation, but by resonance. The soul's intelligence is synchronistic, not strategic. It aligns you with what you need, not necessarily what you want. The challenge is trust. The ego demands guarantees, the soul offers mystery. Quiet power is the ability to live within that mystery without collapsing into fear. To act without anxiety. To move without forcing. To speak without convincing. The power that needs no audience. When Jung spoke of individuation, he described it as a process of becoming who you truly are, not by acquiring more, but by shedding what isn't you. The self does not crave an audience because it is already whole. Its authority is intrinsic. You can feel this in the presence of truly integrated people. They don't dominate a room, but the room feels different when they're in it. Their words carry weight, not because they're loud, but because they come from alignment. They embody a presence that cannot be faked, a presence born from years of confrontation with their own shadow. This is the soul's quiet intelligence, it cannot be taught, only lived. It's not found in self-help slogans or affirmations, but in the honest work of self-observation, of letting the unconscious speak through dreams, symbols, and intuition. The ego performs confidence, the soul emanates it. One depends on recognition, the other transcends it. One ends when the applause stops, the other begins in silence. Section 3, When the soul reclaims the throne, the return of real power. There comes a moment in every life, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, when the performance collapses. The masks that once fit perfectly begin to suffocate. The victories lose their taste. The applause fades into a kind of silence that feels almost mocking. And what stands revealed, beneath all the noise and image, is the one thing the ego fears most: emptiness. For Jung, this collapse is not a failure. It's an initiation. It's the moment when the soul begins to reclaim the throne. The ego has ruled long enough, shouting, grasping, pretending. But the psyche can only tolerate that imbalance for so long. When the persona becomes too rigid, when the noise of self-promotion drowns out the whisper of the inner voice, something deeper begins to rebel. You start to feel it as exhaustion, a fatigue that no sleep fixes. You start losing interest in proving yourself. Even ambition begins to feel hollow, like chasing smoke. Jung called this the enantiodromia, the turning of things into their opposite. The psyche, he said, always seeks equilibrium. And so the more inflated the ego becomes, the stronger the counterforce that rises from the unconscious. This is not punishment, it's correction. The soul is not trying to destroy the ego, it's trying to restore order. When the soul reclaims the throne, power changes meaning. It no longer refers to dominance, status, or control. It becomes something inward, something self-contained. Power becomes the capacity to remain whole, to act without losing yourself in action, to love without dissolving into the other, to succeed without becoming enslaved by success. In this state, silence stops being a void and becomes a presence. You stop explaining yourself. You stop fighting to be understood. You stop confusing reaction with relevance. You become comfortable being unseen, because you finally see yourself. This is what Jung meant by individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, beyond the ego's illusions. It's not self-improvement, it's self-recovery. It's the moment when the false king, the ego that shouted its way into power, is quietly dethroned by the deeper self. And that dethroning doesn't happen through force. It happens through insight. Through surrender. Through a kind of spiritual fatigue that leads you, not to collapse, but to clarity. You realize that the soul doesn't need to win, it only needs to be. The people who reach this stage often appear subdued to the world. They speak less. They listen more. Their presence feels grounded, even magnetic, though they make no effort to impress. They are not driven by insecurity anymore, but by alignment. You'll notice something strange about them: they don't chase energy, they generate it. Their calm is contagious because it's not an act, it's a natural consequence of inner order. Jung would call this the return of the self, the moment when the center of gravity shifts from the ego to the total psyche. And yet, this return doesn't mean the ego dies. It simply learns its place. The ego becomes a servant, not a ruler. A tool, not a tyrant. The false hierarchy of the psyche is reversed, and everything falls back into its rightful orbit. The soul is the sun, quiet, steady, life-giving. The ego is a planet, bright only when reflecting that light. When this balance is restored, power becomes quiet again, not because it is weak, but because it no longer needs to shout. You no longer crave victory, because you've stopped seeing life as a battlefield. You no longer fear loss, because you no longer identify with what can be taken from you. The very structure of your inner life shifts from defense to presence. This is what Jung meant when he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. To live from the soul is to act without distortion, to move through the world with a kind of serene inevitability. Your power is no longer reactive, it's generative. Your calm is no longer passive, it's sovereign. And this sovereignty terrifies the egoic world. Because once you've met your own depth, you can't be bribed by superficial success. Once you've tasted silence, noise feels cheap. Once you've bowed before the soul, no external throne will ever impress you again. This is the return of real power, not loud, not violent, not hungry. It is power that flows effortlessly, precisely because it no longer needs to prove itself. It is the quiet force of someone who has made peace with every part of themselves, their light, their shadow, and the vast, unspoken stillness in between. The ego strives to appear powerful. The soul simply is. The whisper that outlasts the shout. In the end, all the noise fades. The applause, the arguments, the endless striving, they dissolve into the same silence they once tried to drown out. And in that silence, something waits. Something that has been waiting all along. It's the whisper of the soul, the one voice that never competed, never demanded, never shouted to be heard. It speaks not in words, but in presence. Not through control, but through clarity. Jung understood that most of what we call success is just the ego's way of avoiding its own insignificance. We build towers of identity to escape the stillness inside, because that stillness exposes the truth: we were never in control. But when you stop resisting that truth, a strange peace arrives. You realize the soul was never trying to defeat the ego, it was trying to free it. Quiet power is not withdrawal. It's not weakness or detachment. It's the ability to move without losing your center. To speak only when truth demands it. To stand firm, not from pride, but from alignment. Those who find this place rarely talk about it. They have nothing to sell, nothing to prove, nothing to protect. They are not loud, but their silence reshapes the air. They are not many, but their presence alters everything it touches. And perhaps that is Jung's deepest secret: the psyche does not reward the loudest voice. It reveals itself to the one who listens. So if you ever wonder where your power went, look for it in the quiet places you've been avoiding. In the pauses between your thoughts. In the stillness after you stop pretending. That is where the soul waits, patient, watchful, undefeated. And when you finally turn toward it, you'll understand why the whisper always outlasts the shout.